B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, July 31st, 2020. And this is a dark day of reckoning for many Americans who continue to live in fear of the coronavirus and impending poverty and homelessness. And in Washington, the Senate decided to take a break because this kind of heavy lifting is just too much for our vaunted leaders. And this is a true scourge and a dark day for America because even the Democrats cannot be excluded. They are trying to extend the unemployment benefits and pass a $3 trillion package that would bail out state and local governments. And while the HEROES Act has a lot of shit in it, it's much better than anything being discussed, much less proposed by the Republicans. And Americans are facing evictions, what we call food insecurity, which is also called hunger or famine, and increasing risk of exposure to a virus that could make their lives even more miserable, potentially end some of them. And it truly is dark, as the obvious inequities of wealth and income grow even worse. And from the Occupy movement to the alleged socialism of Bernie Sanders, the efforts to close that gap have gotten nowhere, and the situation is actually moving in the other direction as billionaires become even more wealthy during this American crisis. And the sordid struggle as Republicans adopt this kind of high-minded posture that we can't pay people more not to work than they made when they were working. It doesn't matter that their jobs aren't there. They don't have any work to report to. They don't have prospect of finding another job, even in another field. The rent is due. The eviction moratoria at local, state, and the federal level, which covers just a portion of housing in this country. All of this expires today. And the unemployment benefit actually ran out a week ago because most states run their unemployment week starting Sunday and ending on Saturday. And here in California, the head of the unemployment office was hammered on at a hearing in Sacramento yesterday. There's several 100,000 Californians who haven't gotten a single check, even though they filed for unemployment months ago. And I know many people who have received some benefits, but then they suddenly were cut off. They're told to file new forms, they file them, and nothing happens. The Republicans want to throw another curve at the unemployment departments across the country by saying, well, we want to scale the benefit to 70% of what they made before. And this is just so cruel. And it's not figurative or speculative how much hurt this is putting on working families all across America. And so when we get into the details here, the Trump White House is feigning concern for Americans. They want to continue the $600 weekly federal upgrade to unemployment benefits, at least temporarily. At least that's what they say. They're willing to decouple it from Mitch McConnell's demand that anything that hits the Senate floor has to include liability protection, with language stolen from Andrew Cuomo's liability provisions for nursing home and hospital operators in New York State. So, as you know, I'm not a Democrat. And I call them as I see them. And as I mentioned, the Democrats are head and shoulders above what the Republicans are offering. But they are complicit in this mess. They're not addressing the loss of health insurance that millions of Americans have suffered because it was tied to their employment. And of course, they hustled Bernie Sanders out of the race. Medicare for all cannot be discussed. And so I don't like to be a purveyor of gloom, but I feel a duty to honor the interests of African Americans who are getting screwed with no lube and no cushion. So McConnell maintains that the liability language is essential to him. We're not negotiating over liability protection. We're not negotiating with Democrats over that. But the White House said, well, we don't think that's essential. And can't we come back to that later, Mitch? And they put Senator Martha McSally, who is running out of gas and facing re-election. She's from Arizona, by the way. They put her up to offering a 1-week extension of the $600 add-on. And I do think from a negotiating posture, the Democrats are right not to accept a piecemeal approach. And they do get credit for passing a bill out of the House in May that the Republicans ignored all summer long. But that doesn't stop Mark Meadows, he's a Freedom Caucus former member from the House who now plays chief of staff at the White House. He, of course, blames the Democrats, saying they're certainly willing to let some of the American citizens who are struggling the most under this pandemic to go unprotected. As if a cut of $400 a week is protecting the interests of Americans. New unemployment claims continue to climb. 1.4 million this week, and with the spread of the virus and the failure to develop any national response to it, at least 20 states are going to see declines in employment even further for the foreseeable future. So our snapshot that I get from the Ipsos polling company, only 23% of Americans would support Trump if he lost the election but refused to accept the results. But 45% of Republicans would support him. And his attacks on mail-in voting resonate with the right. 74% are concerned about mail-in voter fraud. And as I pointed out in my in-depth interview with Greg Palast this week, catch up with it on the weekend if you haven't already. The only known election fraud related to mail-in ballots was in North Carolina, where Republican operatives ran a ballot harvesting operation, and they made sure that when they harvested those ballots, the ones that were likely from Democrats didn't make it to the elections office. And so Americans have lost any faith in state or local government. Trump's been very successful at that. He's now causing people to have further doubts, and there were legitimate doubts existing before Trump about the validity of our elections and the way they're run. And the pollster here at Ipsos writes, a sitting president with an approval rating below 40% has less than a 50-50 chance to win the election. Trump has even lost ground with Republicans, his approval numbers there dropping from 90% to 81%. 57% disapprove of Trump, only 38% currently approving. And showcasing the divide among Americans, 8% of Democrats and 78% of Republicans approve of the way Trump has been handling the protests across the country and the insertion of federal law enforcement. 52% across the board disagree with that, 80% of Democrats. But 64% of Republicans think it's okay. And so Trump continues to beat the drum about how mail-in voting, this is going to be the greatest election disaster in history, he said again today. It'll be fixed. It'll be rigged. But he didn't repeat his call to delay the election from November 3rd. Now, I just received a mailer from my registrar of voters here in Marin County, California. And it's a she. She did not send me a mail-in ballot. She sent me an application to receive one. But Trump acts like they're just going to mail out these ballots like junk mail or coupons and see what comes back. And it doesn't work that way. But I guess his voters, they should know something about the voter process just by definition. But they appear to be easily misled by the dear tweeter. And now there is a report, we're told not to get too worked up about this, but Charles Stewart III, an MIT elections expert, says, like Greg Palast told us the other day, that mail-in ballots don't always get counted. In Georgia's June primary, people who marked their box with a check mark or an X instead of filling in the ovals, like one of those standardized test forms, those ballots were rejected. He said in 2016, 4% of the mail ballots cast, or 1.4 million, went uncounted. Now, 1.4% seems like a small number, but we have very close elections in this country. As you well know, Trump won in 3 states with a margin alleged of around 70,000 votes. And Greg Palast, in our interview, explains just how many of those numbers were ginned up to begin with, but that is the margin. And Trump appears to want to delegitimize the election so that he can once again play the victim if he loses. The Trump campaign, under a new manager, Bill Stepien, has suspended all of its TV advertising across the country. Although I saw one that, as you may know, I've been complaining about this, bitching a lot about it, but Twitter sends me tweets from Trump that I don't ask for. I don't follow him. I don't want to see his tweets there. But the one that they forced on me this morning was a new campaign ad from the Trump campaign, which tries to rewrite history, saying that it was Trump who decided to stop travel inbound from China at the end of January, that Joe Biden opposed it at the time. And Trump is trying to rewrite his own history and his, cover for his failures in response to the pandemic. He neglects to mention, of course, that even though he claimed to have banned travel, many people came in from China and they weren't even tested for temperature. They didn't even take down their names and addresses to see if they needed to be traced later for carrying the virus. But this is the kind of projection that Trump uses so effectively. He's trying to cover for his own efforts to rewrite history, so he blames Joe Biden for attempting to rewrite history. And on the mail-in ballot claim, again today, Trump is tweeting. Well, I guess this was a second tweet yesterday that I'm just catching up with. He wrote, "Must know election results on the night of the election, not days, months, or even years later." Well, get over it, Donnie boy. We are not going to have a result on election night this year, and there aren't going to be meaningful exit polls to allow the networks to make reasonable projections. That's another issue I discuss with Greg Palast in this week's interview. And now this gets even richer, okay? The White House, where the leader yesterday suggested that we delay our November election, well, he put that blonde Kayleigh McEnany out at the podium today to denounce China because Hong Kong's chief executive has declared that legislative council elections will be delayed for a year in the public interest. Now, TrumpCo has never complained that the coup government we helped install in Bolivia has delayed the promised presidential elections 3 times now. So hypocrisy is rank. Distraction, disruption are the MOs of this White House. And there's so many negatives, it's hard to know, what Trump is actually trying to distract us from with the tweet of the day. Washington State's Attorney General gets some credit for foresight. His name is Bob Ferguson. He's a Democrat. And all the way back in March, he put a couple of his attorneys on an effort to be prepared in case Trump tried to use the pandemic to delay the November presidential election. He directed lawyers in his office to draft a memo analyzing how Trump might try to claim legal authority to change the date, how they could sue to stop it. And Ferguson says he is prepared to pull the trigger on that if Trump actually tries to do it. And yesterday I told you about the co-founder, I think it's John Harris from Politico, who is suggesting that Trump should resign before he really destroys himself. And Timothy Egan, an opinion columnist at the New York Times, echoes that today. He opens with this: "It was clear when Trump woke up Thursday morning with no pollster left to lie to him and not enough Fox News sycophancy to fill his cereal bowl that he would have to play one of the last tricks in the dictator's handbook. He floated the idea of breaching the Constitution by illegally delaying the national election." And in the next paragraph he writes, "He should do humanity a favor and surrender now. He can quit while he's only behind by 10 points or so. More important, by walking away today, he can save many lives of supporters who have listened to the lethal quackery from the presidential podium." So, recognizing that I've just laid out a litany of pretty dark prospects, I'd like to change the tone here for a moment. And I want to thank one of our loyal listeners in Australia. His name is Mark. He's in Melbourne. And Melbourne is the city where they produce these lovely honesty in government videos. And we've got the latest here. I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast, and I encourage you to click on that link so that you can enjoy some of the sight gags and visual jokes that are included in this video.
Hello, I'm from the U.S. government with an update on our pandemic response. In the space of just a few months, our "don't worry bro, it's just the flu" policy has gotten a shit ton of you killed. Some say this tragedy was inevitable, but actually, studies show that if we'd simply responded like other governments who listen to scientists instead of Chuck Woolery and the My Pillow guy, we could have prevented almost all of those deaths. Unfortunately for you, the amount of responsibility we take in doing our job comes to approximately fuck all, which is why we got more of you killed than 50 9/11s. Trump 2020. With a president like this, who needs terrorists? As part of our distract from how many of you we're getting killed policy, we'll be telling you the real threat to America is minorities demanding not to be murdered by cops. And to make you feel safe, we've deployed a secret police force to kidnap people off your streets without probable cause. Some call that taking a dump on the Constitution, but we call it law and order. Thanks to all the well-armed militias cheering us on, as we literally do the one thing the Second Amendment was supposed to prevent. What's that? People are looting in the streets? Oh, darling. looting. The real looting is the one we're doing right here as part of our exploit this crisis to funnel wealth from the poor to the rich policy. Like, remember when we told you COVID was no big deal, so we could buy ourselves just enough time to sell off our personal stocks before the crash, which we knew was coming? Phew. Or when we passed the biggest bailout package in history, which funneled shit tons to corporations and easily forgivable loans. We even gave billions to churches bankrupted by sex abuse scandals. Even the I Love Small Government Rand Institute got some of the loot. But hey, don't forget that single barely above minimum wage check we sent you. You know, the one you simply handed over to your landlord to pay the rent, who in turn handed it to a bank to pay their mortgage, which is how we laundered another $1 trillion to banks through the working class. Profits made, profits kept. Now millions of you face homelessness and 1 in 5 families are going hungry. But look on the bright side. Billionaires regained $500 billion of their wealth. We're not in this together. If you survive till November, be sure to re-elect us so we can get the rest of you killed in the looming climate and extinction crisis. You know, that other crisis we're ignoring and plan to profit from obscenely at your expense. Trump 2020. Fuck you. Of course, we realize that after lying to you, robbing you, and getting your loved ones killed, some of you might be contemplating not voting for us. But don't worry. That's why we've adopted our deregister millions of you policy, as well as our close polling stations, file lawsuits, and let's spread bullshit about voter fraud policy. And if that's still not enough, well, maybe we'll just cancel the election. Trump 2020.
Now, I want to give kudos. They're all the way in Australia. They do have the benefit of being a day ahead of us, but this was delivered to my inbox from Mark. Yesterday, I saw it about 5 p.m. California time. Trump's tweet about delaying the election at that point was about 12 or 13 hours old. And so these honest government ads that come from the team in Melbourne, Australia, I think are devastating. They are funny, but they are deeply factual, and the satire bites and bites hard. So I encourage you to follow the link that's in the show file so you can grab that video from YouTube and share it all over the place. Put it up on your Twitter or Facebook feed or whatever you favor. But I think that it's an important way to educate people about how dire things really are without forcing them to listen to me and my dire description of the current scene. May I change the subject? Today I'm releasing an in-depth interview for my subscribers at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher, featuring an attorney who argued one of the cases related to the Electoral College before the Supreme Court in May. His name is Jason Harrow. He's the executive director and chief counsel at Equal Citizens, and together with Adam Eichen, who is the manager of campaigns at Equal Citizens, they describe what's wrong with the Electoral College, why the Supreme Court got it wrong, but they have at least clarified what the standards are that electors do not have a choice. They are bound by the rules of their state to deliver their electoral vote to the candidate that they were assigned to. And I think that's tragic and a misreading of the intent of the framers who built the indirect presidential election system around the Electoral College. And here's a comment from attorney Jason Harrow, excerpted from the new interview.
As folks know who do the math, all the Clinton electors can kick and scream and vote for whoever they want. It, of course, won't make a difference because the whole reason Clinton lost was she did not have a majority in the Electoral College. So what they were doing, what my clients were doing, what those folks in California you mentioned were doing, was trying to do something that is rare in today's politics, Peter, which is put country over party.
Yeah.
So they were going to be Democrats who would vote for a Republican who is not Donald Trump to show good faith to other Republican electors who would also potentially vote for a Republican who is not Donald Trump. Ultimately, two Texas electors broke and did not vote for Donald Trump, but that was not nearly enough. They needed, I think, 34 electors to break on the Republican side to get Trump below 270, and they got only 2.
That's attorney Jason Harrow. Equal Citizens is the nonprofit that he and Adam Eichen are aligned with, and they have a new website up called fixthecourt.us. There'll be more information in the show file for the interview podcast, and I hope you will give it a listen when you have the time. Well, ladies and gentlemen, peace broke out on the streets of Portland, Oregon last night. At least in part because the federal goon squad did not emerge from the Hatfield Federal Court building. Under the new regime with state troopers managing the crowd control and street operations, the description from the Oregonian is that state police and the local Portland police were barely visible on the streets last night, and the crowd conducted itself in a very peaceful manner. So I could run down the article for you here, but what it fundamentally says is that up to the Oregonian's deadline of about 1:30 a.m. this morning, when 300 people remained in the area, no tear gas had been launched, no pepper spray, no beanbag bullets. And without the irritant of those federal goons, I'm pleased to report that the crowd maintained itself. Still, Homeland Security insists that 130 federal agents will remain near the federal courthouse in Portland as part of a quick reaction force in case things change. And the Associated Press did an analysis of the people who have been arrested so far in Portland. 95% of those who've been arrested are locals. Now, this is not a situation of these anarchists or Antifas who are coming in from other places. Some of the armed white provocateurs might be. The vast majority of the arrestees have no criminal record in Oregon. Many appear to be college students. Average age is 28. They're mostly charged with misdemeanors like failing to comply with a lawful order, while a handful face charges for arson and for destroying federal property. And this really destroys the false claims repeatedly coming from Trump and his minions that things are out of control, that it's anarchist, it's chaos. So I am encouraged by these developments. Meanwhile, Chad Wolf, this toady of Trump's who is currently the temporary boss at Homeland Security, he was shocked to learn that one of his departments has been monitoring journalists and keeping a database, which they turn into baseball cards and share with law enforcement up and down the food chain. So Chad Wolf has ordered his intelligence office to stop collecting information on journalists and said he is going to conduct an investigation and get to the bottom of it. Quote from a department spokesman, upon learning about the practice, Wolf directed the Intelligence and Analysis Directorate to immediately discontinue collecting information involving members of the press. In no way does the acting secretary condone this practice. He has immediately ordered an inquiry into the matter. Sure. They were monitoring a New York Times reporter and Ben Wittes, the editor of Lawfare. Both of them published leaked documents that embarrassed DHS. And I'm sure that's not the only thing that led to the activities of the Intelligence and Analysis Office. Certainly they were trying to find proof of Trump's unproven claims about Antifa and other so-called anarchists. And this report from the Washington Post indicates that the, what is it called? Surveillance and analysis? Let me turn back to the previous page here. Intelligence and Analysis Directorate is considered the runt of the litter in the intelligence community's in Washington, D.C. Now to Seattle, where a federal judge has set 5 days aside, starting August 26, for a hearing to determine whether Seattle police are in contempt of an injunction barring the use of force on peaceful protesters, saying enormous issues are at stake. The judge, Richard Jones, told attorneys for the city that he would not grant a 60-day delay. They wanted the time to review all the body camera footage of their officers. But he says the nature of the proceedings in this court have citywide impact. He refused to delay. Quote, "The court believes there is urgency. The court is concerned about the issues raised." He did decline a request by Black Lives Matter that the department turn over all 1,400 body camera videos for their review. And the police department said they will be shared as they are processed. Meanwhile, one of the issues that's in dispute that I talked about over the last couple of days is that last Saturday, Police Chief Carmen Best in Seattle claimed that explosives had been used to blow a small hole into a wall at the East Precinct police station. And I now have a picture of the damage. And it appears that it was particle board or perhaps drywall that was impacted. And there's no smoke or burn marks. And so the independent newspaper in Seattle, The Stranger, has basically developed contradictory information that says that this was something like an M80 or a cherry bomb. Is that an explosive? I believe the proper term is a firework. And over at The Intercept, Kim Zetter goes at great lengths, 24 pages when I printed it out, describing the use of stingrays. And we've talked about this. We helped expose these devices that simulate a cell phone tower, cause all local phones to check in with it, has incredible capabilities to read your contacts, your recent calls, capture your voicemails. And we believe some of the devices are capable of listening to your communications in real time. And The Intercept is unable to flatly confirm that Stingray and companion devices called dirt boxes were deployed in aircraft operated by the DEA and the federal marshals. But they highly suspect that, and then they go into a kind of a primer about the use of these devices. And if you haven't caught up with my coverage of this, just go to the search window at peterbcollins.com, and you can just type in the word Stingray. And some of our early reports, which describe these devices and their capabilities, will pop up for you. Kudos to David Sirota, who is exposing why New York Governor Andrew Cuomo is opposed to attacks on billionaires. It's because over a third of them are huge contributors to the war chest of Cuomo and the Democratic Party. Sirota reports that there are 118 total billionaire families in the state of New York. 43 of the 118 have delivered more than $8 million to Cuomo's political machine over his 3 terms as governor. And just in recent weeks, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others have promoted the idea of raising taxes on billionaires to cover the shortfall in revenues and the likely cuts of state spending that will be required. 11 of Cuomo's billionaire donors have delivered $100,000 or more to his campaign coffer just in recent weeks. They include hedge fund titans James Simons, $3.6 million, Stanley Druckenmiller, $1 million, Daniel Loeb, $114,000, real estate moguls Alexander Ravd, $321,000, Steve Ross, $80,000, Ron Perelman, $197,000. And this is what really hurts. I referred to this broadly earlier. And this is just New York State and just the billionaire donors who've supported Cuomo. Those 43 billionaires have seen their net worth increase by $22 billion just this year. They are profiteering on a pandemic. And Cuomo says, well, look, the money's got to come from somewhere, so he's planning to raise subway fares and toll road fees. Okay. Also, I want to commend to you a fresh commentary from Caitlin Johnstone. I don't know where she is in Australia. She might be in Melbourne. Anyway, she writes with such competence about the ugly American scene these days. And she opens her latest column by attacking the New York Times for what she calls an astonishingly horrible article the other day titled, "Latin America is facing a decline in democracy under the pandemic," accusing governments like Venezuela and Nicaragua of exploiting COVID-19 to quash opposition and oppress democracy. Johnstone says the crown jewel of this piece of State Department stenography reads as follows, quote, "Adding to these challenges, democracy in Latin America has also lost a champion in the United States, which had played an important role in promoting democracy after the end of the Cold War by financing good governance programs and calling out authoritarian abuses." Johnstone has a rejoinder. The United States has never at any time been a champion of democracy in Latin America before or since the Cold War. It has intervened hundreds of times in the continent's affairs throughout history with everything from murderous corporate colonialism to deadly CIA regime change operations to overt military invasions. It is currently trying to orchestrate a coup in Venezuela. It's pushing regime change in Nicaragua. And the New York Times itself admitted this year that it was wrong to promote the false U.S. government narrative of electoral shenanigans in Bolivia's presidential race last year, a narrative which facilitated a bloody fascist coup. But Johnstone doesn't stop there. Quote, "This is propaganda. There's no other word for it. Yet the only other time Western politicians and news reporters use that word is to talk about nations like Russia and China. And that means that the U.S. has state propaganda. They just don't call it that." And she makes the strong case that our corporate media is joined at the hip with the state and in turn becomes state propaganda. And then she pivots. We also see it in the sexual blackmail operation facilitated by the late Jeffrey Epstein in connection with billionaire Leslie Wexner and Israeli intelligence, along with potentially the FBI and or other U.S. intelligence agencies. Today, the Internet is abuzz about newly unsealed court documents relating to Epstein and his co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell. And these depositions reveal witness testimony regarding underage sex trafficking, with names like Alan Dershowitz, Bill Clinton, and Prince Andrew. Once again, Clinton has denied that he ever visited St. James Island, which was the rock owned by Epstein in the Caribbean. The woman in these depositions, Virginia Jeffrey Roberts, she flatly says she saw Clinton there. The groundskeeper told documentarians in this Netflix piece that's up right now, he saw Bill Clinton there. And in a separate report now from the Washington Post, more details on the deposition that is being unsealed. Jeffrey claimed that Maxwell recruited her to serve as a traveling masseuse for Epstein after spotting her working at Mar-a-Lago as a locker room attendant. Her deposition was among several hundred pages of records unsealed late yesterday. She describes Maxwell and Epstein as a toxic team that repeatedly exploited her, emphasizing that Maxwell brought me in for the purpose of being trafficked. Jeffrey was just as a part of it as she was. Maxwell was just as a part of it as he was, she's quoted as saying. She went on later about Maxwell. She's the one who abused me on a regular basis. She's the one that procured me, told me what to do, trained me as a sex slave, abused me physically, abused me mentally. She's the one I believe in my heart of hearts deserves to come forward and have justice happen to her more than anybody. Being a woman, it's disgusting. The unsealed documents also make a liar out of Maxwell, who told authorities recently that she had no contact with Epstein for many years, a decade. But there are emails between the two of them in January of 2015. And so we have Alan Dershowitz claiming that he is releasing any privacy rights he has because he is so firm in his conviction that he never received sexual favors from the girls recruited by Maxwell and Epstein. Prince Andrew continues to deny, and nobody believes it. Bill Clinton continues to deny, and you can decide whether you believe him. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, we have 17.3 million confirmed cases of coronavirus, with 674,000 reported deaths. In the United States, the case count is up to 4.5 million, and total deaths at 152,000. Yesterday, at least 1,237 new coronavirus deaths were reported, 67,000 new cases. Over the past week, there's been an average of 64,000 new cases per day, which is a decrease of 1% from the average 2 weeks earlier. Total death count so far, about 153,000 in the United States. And in an open letter signed by more than 1,000 health professionals, there's a call for a reset in our coronavirus response. It would essentially mean going back to where we were in March, imposing widespread shutdowns and lockdowns, universal mask mandates, and a federally controlled response to COVID-19. There are many calls now for Crown Prince Jared Kushner to resign from his unpaid position in the White House. Vanity Fair has a lengthy report published today revealing that a secret project run by Kushner to devise a comprehensive plan that would have massively ramped up and coordinated testing at the federal level was shelved. Why? Because the determination was it was going to help people in blue states too much. Now that's a very deadly political calculation interjected in a pandemic response. Linda Lewis, a whistleblower and an emergency response planner herself, she put parenthetically, right there they made a huge mistake. Emergency plans devised without input from the organizations that will implement them are doomed to fail. So Kushner's team hammered out a detailed plan, which Vanity Fair obtained. Quote, current challenges that need to be resolved include uneven testing capability and supplies throughout the U.S., both between and within regions, significant delays in reporting results, and national supply chain constraints. The plan was to be presented to Trump and announced publicly in early April. A public health expert in contact with the task force reported that a member of Kushner's team commented that because the virus had hit blue states hardest, a national plan was unnecessary and would not make sense politically. I mean, this is just so callous. People can die because the number one priority is to reelect Daddy. And the unnamed expert said the political folks believed that because it was going to be relegated to Democratic states, they could blame those governors, and that would be an effective political strategy. It was very clear that Jared was ultimately the decision maker as to what was going to come out. At an April 27th briefing, the testing plan announced by Trump bore almost no resemblance to the one that had been forged in late March and shifted the problem of diagnostic testing almost entirely to individual states. Vanity Fair mentions a detailed plan released by the Rockefeller Foundation on April 21st that proposed an all-hands-on-deck approach that would unite federal, state, and local governments, academic institutions, private, nonprofit sectors. Together, they would optimize laboratory capacity, create an emergency supply chain, build a 300,000-strong contact tracing health corps, create a real-time public data platform. Well, if we're going to reset, they've already got the plan. They just have to decide that blue lives, referring to the designation of Democrats, matter to them. Today, the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus held a hearing to examine the urgent need for a comprehensive national plan. Fauci was there, Dr. Redfield from the Centers for Disease Control, and Brett Giroir, who is the White House, he's got a title, Assistant Health Secretary, that's his title. So James Clyburn, the chair of the committee, opened by saying that the Trump administration has still not developed and implemented a national strategy to protect the American people. He continued, the administration's approach of deferring to states, sidelining experts, and rushing to reopen has prolonged this virus and led to thousands of preventable deaths. But, of course, ever-loyal Steve Scalise, subcommittee's top Republican, dismissed Clyburn's criticisms as political posturing. And Linda has a comment here. She says, Scalise's comment is appallingly incorrect. I spent 16 years writing and evaluating emergency plans. The documents Scalise mentioned are not emergency plans. They're agency guidance. A federal emergency plan describes and coordinates actions its component agencies will take. Instead, a few agencies, mainly the CDC, have issued guidance, advice that others are free to follow or ignore. There is no evidence that the administration ever implemented a federal pandemic plan, although it inherited several from previous administrations. That failure resulted in a chaotic federal response that in turn hampered state efforts because state plans are influenced by and coordinate with federal plans. So Dr. Fauci, once again, offering optimism, I'd call it blue sky, said the U.S. will likely have a safe and effective coronavirus vaccine by the end of this year or early 2021. Okay. I think that is a forward-looking statement, as they say in financial investment documents. And 95% of adults are now wearing a mask at least some of the time, 79% all of the time when they leave their homes. And here's an encouraging piece, very optimistic, from a pair of immunologists at Yale University, Akiko Iwasaki and Ruslan Medzitov. It's in the New York Times today, and I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. What it says is that we should not be alarmed that the antibody counts from people who have been through a bout of COVID-19, either with symptoms or without. And the fact that they have a short life is not overly alarming to them. And they point to the body's natural immunity systems, the release of T cells and B cells, the innate immunity which jumps into action and tries to kill a virus when it attempts to infect a body. A virus causes disease by entering cells and hijacking their genetic machinery to reproduce itself again and again. T cells detect and kill those infected cells. B cells make antibodies, a kind of protein that binds to the viral particles and blocks them from entering our cells. The body then stores the T and B cells that help eliminate the infection in case it might need them in the future. These are so-called memory cells that are the main agents of long-term immunity. So they say it's normal that as a virus recedes, the antibodies decrease because the body doesn't think that it needs to maintain that kind of vigilance. So I invite you to read this. I continue to have concerns about the promises of a vaccine in the near future. We have to put it in context with the failed vaccines of the past, the profiteering and the liability protection that virus manufacturers enjoy, and the pure politics of the Trump administration, writing a lot of contracts for individuals and firms that have contributed to the Trump juggernaut. And this is not as cheery as the preceding story. In the New York Times today, a report based on studies at the University of, at the Robert Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago. Infected children have at least as much of the coronavirus in their noses and throats as infected adults. Indeed, children younger than age 5 may host up to 100 times as much of the virus in the upper respiratory tract as adults do. That measurement does not necessarily prove children are passing the virus to others. But they talk about what are called CTs, for cycle thresholds. And they report that older children and adults had about 11 CTs, ranging up to 17, but children younger than age 5 had significantly lower CTs of around 6.5. But some of those children were in the upper range closer to 12, which is similar to the situation with adults. So I know you'd love to hear me say that the study rules out kids and that schools can safely reopen. But the truth is we don't know. And do we want to reopen our schools and send the children, the students, and the teachers, staff members too? Do we want to put them at risk based on our ignorance and wishing and hoping? I would argue no. Ohio is the state of my birth. I checked out at age 18 when I went to college, never moved back. There are two factors. One is the high humidity in the summertime, and the other is the Republican machine that runs my hometown of Cincinnati and has dominated the state for years. And in Columbus today, a moment of courage as the Republican majority ousted its House Speaker after his indictment in an alleged $60 million bribery scheme. Speaker Larry Householder is the first Ohio House Speaker ever removed. The scheme was legislation that he carried that collected fees related to nuclear power plants, and he apparently skimmed quite a bit off the surface, if the allegations can be believed. I was really surprised by this one that came across my desk just a few minutes before I sat down to record the podcast today. A federal appeals court ruled today to vacate the death sentence of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. He was the younger brother of Tamerlan Tsarnaev, and the two were accused of orchestrating the Boston Marathon bombing. Tamerlan, of course, died in a shootout with the police. But Dzhokhar, the younger brother, he survived by climbing into a boat that was on a trailer in somebody's backyard. Shots were fired into it, but he miraculously survived. And if you were listening to my coverage at the time, and also some great reporting, the last great reporting I've seen from Who, What, Why, there are so many unanswered questions about the Boston Marathon incident. The uncle of the two Tsarnaev brothers was tight with a CIA officer, Craig Fuller. Russian intelligence tried to warn the United States about the Tsarnaev brothers. There were security forces, apparently private ones, who were on the scene at the finish line of the Boston Marathon when the bombing occurred. I could go on. There are many anomalies. And so this is quite remarkable. Now, the Court of Appeals in the First Circuit indeed vacated his death sentence on 5 counts, saying that the judge erred on many issues. But the decision noted, just to be crystal clear, because we are affirming the convictions, there were 3, and the many life sentences imposed on those remaining counts, Dzhokhar will remain confined to prison for the rest of his life, and the only question remaining being whether the government will end his life by executing him. And that, at least for now, has been taken off the table. There could be further appeals. A Florida teenager was arrested early today in connection with the recent high-profile hack of 130 Twitter accounts. 17-year-old Graham Clark is alleged to be the mastermind of the hack that turned into an embarrassment for Twitter. Federal authorities claim they were already tracking Clark before the Twitter hack. In April, the Secret Service seized over $700,000 worth of Bitcoin from him. The Tampa youth faces 30 felony charges, including fraud, and is being charged as an adult. Now, I have to ask why. There was no threat to lives in this incident. And people who got one of these tweets from Barack Obama's account or anybody else that said, hey, send me $1,000 and I'll send you $2,000 of Bitcoin. I mean, anybody who believed that scam and bid on it, I think we have to hold them to some level of responsibility. Now, young Mr. Clark apparently collected about $180,000 in Bitcoin on that single day on July 15th, when hackers tweeted from 45 different accounts, accessed the direct messages of 36 accounts, and downloaded full information from 7 accounts. Speaking of Twitter, the San Francisco-based platform has announced that David Duke, former leader of the KKK, has been permanently banned from Twitter. Now, as you know, I am an extreme advocate for the First Amendment. I believe even David Duke has free speech rights. But Twitter is a privately owned platform. They have their own rules of community standards, they call them. And this just shows how arbitrary their enforcement of those rules happens to be. I don't defend David Duke, and I don't need to see his tweets. I don't need to see Trump's tweets. But there is no clear standard, and the enforcement is so arbitrary and scattered. And earlier this week, we saw how the Trump family was sanctioned by Twitter for promoting the video of the crackpot Dr. Emmanuel. But the central point, that she was making public comments about hydroxychloroquine, and that her comments have been stifled and erased. I find very, very disturbing. And finally today, for a weekend read, I recommend a visit to consortiumnews.com or just follow the link at peterbcollins.com in today's show file. Because British reporters from a site called Declassified UK, Mark Curtis and Matt Kennard, take a deep dive into the history of the judge presiding over the Julian Assange extradition case. Her name is Vanessa Baratzer. And in 96% of the cases that she has presided over related to extradition, she has approved that extradition. That would be 23 out of 24 cases that have come before her court. And they go through a litany of all of the biased moves that have been made in the pretrial process of the Assange case, their clear collusion with U.S. authorities, and a good bit more. So check it out, and you'll know more as we prepare for the September hearings that will ultimately lead to the extradition of Julian Assange to the United States. Thanks for joining me today for my News and Comment podcast. I hope you have a great weekend. You can share this podcast all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube for your convenience. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.